So I don't think I've talked enough about Final Fantasy on this channel yet. If 3-hour-long reviews didn't make it clear enough, you might be aware that I am not a big fan of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. There are a lot of reasons I dislike those games, and you can check out those videos if you want to understand why. But I'll give you a quick summarization as to why I hated the original 13 so much. 13 had terrible writing, boring characters, overly linear gameplay, a mindless leveling process, and a nonsensical story. Now, with those reviews, I happen to be on the same side as the more popular consensus, so those videos went over relatively well, but a lot of my same criticisms are directed at a more popular and more beloved installment of the Final Fantasy franchise, and there's no easy way to do this, so I'm just gonna come out and say it, I don't like Final Fantasy X. Yeah, I dislike one of the most beloved and highest rated RPGs of all time. But why? With 13 the problems were clear, but 10 somehow always comes up in a positive light. Well, there are a lot of reasons that I dislike this game that we'll get into, but upon this most recent playthrough, I decided to challenge myself. I wanted to take the time and figure out just why people think this game is good. How did it trick so many players into overlooking its glaring flaws? Now, I first played this game years ago and was really underwhelmed by it, and replaying it can only do so much. Replaying a game could surely help me discern the things that I dislike and the things that I do like, but I can never have that first impression again. So for this review, I decided to get help. I needed a fresh pair of eyes to experience this game with me and see if I'm really missing something here. So I've enlisted the help of a YouTuber named JillieFoo. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello folks, JillieFoo here, and well, this game. I've always heard fantastic things about Final Fantasy X growing up, and well, since it was coming out for the Switch at the time, it just seemed like fate. But I ended up buying it for the PS4 instead because it was cheaper, but you know, it's not here nor there. But for this review, I act as a controlled opinion, not bogged down by nostalgia for the game. So, this game was an interesting experience, to say the least. And well, thank you for having me, RS. It's nice to be here.
No problem. I need someone to share this misery with. Well, now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X opens up in the futuristic city of Zanarkand. This is where we meet our main character, Tidus.
I personally call him Titus rather than the Japanese proper way, because, well, his name was never really spoken in the game, and I just think Titus sounds better.
Tidus is a famous athlete for the popular sport blitzball and is on his way to compete in a memorial match dedicated to his late father, Jack. But during Tidus' game, the city is attacked by a giant monstrosity known only as Sin.
Amongst the chaos, Titus meets up with his mentor, Auron, who is arguably the best character in the game. Titus tries to escape the attack,
but he and Auron are ultimately engulfed by Sin. Tidus wakes up in some ruins and is found by a group of scavengers led by a girl named Riku. Riku's group initially treats Tidus as a hostage, but let him prove his usefulness by having him help them activate some underwater ruins.
After the scavenging mission, Titus finally has a moment to talk with Riku. When he says he's from Zanarkand, however, Riku informs him that Zanarkand was destroyed by Sin 1,000 years ago, and Titus is very shocked by this revelation.
However, before he can really understand his situation, Riku's ship is also attacked by Sin, and once again, Tidus is swept away into chaos.
He wakes up again off the coast of the island of Besaid, where he meets the local blitzball team and their captain, Wakka. During their conversation, Wakka confirms the destruction of Zanarkand to Titus, and Wakka takes Titus to his village to rest up.
Tidus finds Wakka in the local temple where he learns that the temple summoner apprentice hasn't returned from their training. Tidus decides to defy the church's taboos and runs in to find the apprentice.
By the way, he does this after being in their village for a single day, so yeah, that's a nice first impression, man.
Like I care!
Wakka soon follows Tidus, revealing himself to be one of the summoner's guardians. The two of them meet up with the other guardians, Lulu and Kimahri. Just as they arrive, however, the summoner Yuna finally exits her trial. After completing her training, Yuna is given the ability to summon a powerful creature known as an Aeon.
The next day, Yuna and her guardians set off on her pilgrimage, a journey carried out by summoners to defeat Sin. Yuna's group is going to stop at all the temples in Spirit to acquire other Aeons. They decide to bring Titus with them up until the island where the blitzball games are being held because they feel someone would recognize him there.
From here on out, Tidus' goal is to understand the truth of where he is, what is Sin, and how to get back to Zanarkand. Final Fantasy X's story has a relatively solid foundation. It weaves a tale of morality, love, and faith. Faith being the most notable one because organized religion plays a major factor in the story. both in terms of how good and how bad it can be and how it can affect the people following it. It's actually a pretty great idea. The execution sort of falls apart by the end of it though. But I like how this story addresses how people use faith as a source of inspiration, while others use it as a tool to control. It's a nice bit of social commentary without feeling on the nose or obvious. I just wish the commentary was a little bit more thought-provoking or a tad more complex.
Themes about overly trusting faith and that faith manipulating its followers was done 2 years later in a game called Tales of Symphonia, which honestly does a far better job at making you feel the betrayal on a larger scale. Whereas in Final Fantasy X, the feeling of betrayal feels more like, oh, okay, that happened. Because the betrayal feels secondary and not even that big of a revelation.
The perception of the Albed is an example of something I wish was more fleshed out. They are a group that doesn't follow the teachings of Yevon and use Machina, which go against what the church preaches. Because of this, they are seen as infidels and outcasts by the devout followers such as Waka. The commentary there is actually pretty good, but the game does the same old trope of making the people without religion look overly weird. I hate this trope just because it simplifies what could be an interesting discussion to societies without religion look odd and unrelatable. There's also a reoccurring theme of loss with pretty much everyone in your party, and I think that's an excellent thing to have. However, very few of these losses resonate because the majority of them are either off-screen or entirely glossed over. I don't think everyone needed a super detailed backstory to encapsulate their loss, but I feel they should have fleshed out the more interesting ones. I do enjoy that the main villain of this game is not your typical Final Fantasy bad guy. The main threat of the game is an entity, and no matter what happens in the story, the end goal is always the same: defeat Sin. Sin is just a powerful giant creature with no dialogue. I like that the complexities within the plot are not amplified by having another overly complex main threat. Its power is never downplayed throughout the game. Our party constantly loses to it, and despite this surface level simplicity, the origins of just who and what Sin is becomes more fascinating as the story progresses without ruining the initial perception of it. I am also interested in how this creature with a religious background to it attacks technology frequently. It's a fascinating commentary on religion's relationship with scientific advancements.
And this theme is even more comparable with Japanese depictions of creatures like Godzilla, a monster of force and nature that punishes mankind for dabbling in nuclear power by destroying its technology and their cities. These comparable traits are what make creatures like Sin and Godzilla awe-inspiring to behold.
Most of the stuff with Sin I thought was well executed. Unfortunately, the game does have a secondary villain who is just awful and cliche. He's made worse by the fact that he sticks around way longer than he logically should, to the point where he feels like a villain out of a Saturday morning cartoon. He just really sucks. I understand why he was included, but he really brought the game down for me because of how ultimately pointless he was. There are certain plot aspects that feel forgotten or unexplained by the end of the game. This game's relationship with death in particular I found to be unclear and kind of stupid. Since Tidus is the fish out of water character, a lot of exposition is explained to him by other characters. Ordinarily, I wouldn't mind this, but they rely on it way too much with no variation, so it starts feeling like I'm being read a book report. They say that people lose memory if they come into contact with Sin's toxin. Tidus uses this as an excuse to cover up his own ignorance towards the workings of Spira, but this is the only time Sin's toxin is ever mentioned, so it just seems like lazy writing.
Yeah, almost no one else is exposed to the toxin, or those who are don't live to tell the tale, so either way, it just seems like some kind of excuse.
There are some really jarring tonal shifts that lead to a lot of instances of me scratching my head. The events after Operation Mi'ihen being a prime example, the middle section of the game drags on in a way that just feels like padding. There's also some massive leaps in logic that disconnect me from the characters that I'll talk about in a sec. As a whole, 10's story is good, but I feel another rewrite would have brought all these concepts together in a more organic fashion. One of the first issues I have with Final Fantasy X is that I don't really gravitate towards any of the characters. I don't think they are especially awful, but most of them aren't interesting and I tend to find many aspects of them annoying. Tidus, our main character, is a prime example of this. I just don't like him. Despite being the game's narrator, he's not very introspective. His observations are very surface level and don't really add much to what's happening. He starts off as a lighthearted, sort of egotistical celebrity, which I think would have been an interesting character dynamic. I think I would have liked the angle of an arrogant, almost spoiled character growing more and more humble as the story progresses with his celebrity status being stripped away from him. But they really don't go far with that concept. While he does mature as the game goes on, he actually just becomes less interesting. There are certain revelations about him towards the end of the game that he has very little reaction to, and this just alienates me.
There are a lot of ways they could have had him react to this revelation, and they do nothing with it. One of the main things they focus on with Titus is his relationship with his father Jecht.
I found this to be one of the weakest aspects of the game because almost nothing develops with it. There are certain things they do involving Titus watching Sphere videos left by his father to provide insight on their relationship, but by the end of the game, I just feel like I missed a more interesting character. A lot of what they imply happened with Jecht is sort of what I wish they did with Titus throughout his journey with Yuna's group. At the end of the day, I just find Titus to be a rather unimportant character and more of an observer to another person's story.
While I agree with you about Titus and his character development, I will say I feel that the detachments for his character is possibly due to him being a foil for the player themselves, since he's technically never verbally named in the whole game. But most foils have some personality, which Titus greatly lacks.
Wakka falls into kind of the same category, but he doesn't bother me as much because he is not the main character. Wakka's function in the story is to regurgitate the teachings of Yevon. He's often praying and blindly following these religious ideologies, sometimes to a dangerous extent.
He has a strong prejudice against the Albed race, since their way of life goes against the church's teachings. This prejudice is fueled further when his younger brother Chapu is killed by Sin using Albed Machina.
I like how they show the good sides of his faith without shying away from the more vitriolic sides of it. His role as the muscle is not one you typically associate with this kind of character, but it works for me. I think he's good enough to be thought of as a character rather than just a trope. Wakka suffers from the same glaring flaw most of the other characters suffer from, but I'll get to that in a bit. But I think I like Wakka fine enough. Lulu is another one of Yuna's guardians. She was dating Wakka's brother before he died. I can only wonder what he saw in her. She's not super interesting for the majority of the game. She's pretty flat. Even when she's yelling, she sounds bored.
Other than maybe Titus, the theme of loss is probably the most realized with her. This is because on top of losing her lover, she also failed to protect the previous summoner, and the emotional baggage from that is here, albeit minimally.
Yeah, and when she does bring it up, it's kind of at random times. Her relationship with Wakka is one that feels natural. She constantly shuts down any of his positivity about coping with loss, and she maintains a harsh but understandable viewpoint. It's enjoyably uncomfortable. Her and Wakka often bring up how much Titus looks like Chapu. Fucking twins, right? Lulu, like a lot of characters, spews a lot of exposition, which is kind of made worse given how monotonous her voice can be. I never disliked her, but I never liked her either. She was just kind of blank. The same goes for Kimahri. He's another of Yuna's guardians and is a member of the proud Ronso warrior race. I like his design, but he's kind of just a tough, silent archetype. He doesn't speak for like the first third of the game. He feels a great sense of shame because his horn is broken, and as a result, he is outcasted by fellow Ronso. It's a really simple backstory, and while it makes sense given the primitive mindset his people have, it doesn't make for a compelling character.
And so little is done with the Ronso that it feels like you miss out on a lot of potentially interesting world building.
Honestly, if you took Kimahri out of the story, I don't think much of anything would really change. The other tough guy we have is Auron. Auron was evidently a friend of Jecht and guided Yuna's late father, Lord Braska, on the last successful pilgrimage that defeated Sin. Auron is the only interesting character of the party. His backstory is a mystery that the audience learns more and more about, and it's actually really compelling. In the beginning, we're never really sure what Auron's deal is. We can tell he knows more than he lets on, but he doesn't talk much about himself. He just talks about the mission. It's like he knows the grand plan from the start, and he's just subtly guiding the party to where he knows they need to be. He's just a badass. And despite the fact that we don't know much about him, we always know that we can trust him.
As the game goes on and more of his backstory is shown to us, the more complex and interesting he becomes.
I can't say that he should have been the main character because his story is over and the focus needs to remain on Titus, but Auron overshadows Titus to the point where he makes Titus seem completely redundant. There's never a feeling that they learn from each other. It always just feels like Titus learns from Auron while offering nothing in return.
Agreed. Auron more or less comes off as a father figure to Titus, but that relationship consists of him giving him vague wise advice or blatantly telling him to stop being such a child.
Even if you don't think that the mentor needs to learn from his pupil, the pupil still needs to be interesting. and like I said before, I just don't think Tidus is a particularly great lead. But we're supposed to be talking about Auron, and all in all, I think Auron is great and is probably my favorite character in the game.
Riku is the first person in Spira that Tidus meets. Riku is our Al-Bhed character and is actually Yuna's cousin.
It's hard to talk about her involvement in the plot without spoiling her goal, so we're just gonna focus on her character. She's kinda spunky and friendly, I guess, but like many other people in the game, is not interesting. Her whole character seems to just be in this game to set up a reveal later in the story. Don't get me wrong, I totally get her motivation. Past that though, there's not much to her character outside of just being the plucky one. I guess we've talked a lot about the people surrounding Yuna, but not much about Yuna herself. Yuna is our summoner. She is the only daughter of High Summoner Lord Braska. She wants to defeat Sin and bring peace to Spira like her father did before her. Yuna is quite likable. She is very kind-hearted, incredibly selfless, and charmingly naive. I love her determination to finish this pilgrimage and defeat Sin no matter what. Even beyond her pilgrimage, she's often just helping people because that's just what she wants to do.
The journey does take a constant physical toll on Yuna that's very visible, but she pushes through all the hardships to reach her goal. Even when she tries to give up, she ultimately can't bring herself to do it, and wants to continue no matter the cost. She can't lie to herself. She knows what she wants.
Yuna has a lot of good qualities. However, her romance with Tidus is completely forced and out of left field. She barely knows this guy, but for some reason wants to keep talking to him, and the rate in which this romance progresses is way too fast with no real chemistry. Tidus being interested in Yuna is totally within his character, and his place as an outsider disassociates him from the bigger picture. Because of that, he doesn't have the literal weight of the world on his shoulders like Yuna does, and he can have this sort of lighthearted, almost impulsive interest. But with how Yuna is set up and with what her journey ultimately ends in, it would make way more sense for them to develop her feelings reluctantly, like she doesn't want to fall in love. There's a flashback later in the game where Yuna sort of confesses her love for Tidus, and it's just way too soon. Plus they don't talk about much of anything other than what's happening in the moment. There's only one real scene where they bond, but it's quickly ruined. I just don't believe that Yuna would be interested in this. I'm actually sad that this selfless, kind character is ending up with this guy, but that's because I genuinely like Yuna. Like I said, the cast is by no means horrible. Honestly, they aren't even that bad, but a few of them feel pointless, and with the exception of Auron, many of them just don't engage me. There is one major flaw with almost all the characters in your party. It's a constant problem that keeps me disconnected with them and their decisions. You may not notice it now, but if we just put them under this X-ray, we'll see that... Yep, there it is. These characters are dumb. Like, really dumb. Yuna might even be the dumbest. Some of their choices in the middle of the game are so asinine that I can't possibly bring myself to feel sorry for them when they end up in bad situations. Maybe if you fuckers actually thought things through, you wouldn't be in this predicament. It's so frustrating to see these characters do things that I know will obviously end badly for them. At the end of the day, the cast of Final Fantasy X is okay. I don't think most of them are super annoying. Most of them. When all is said and done, I will follow them on their journey, but I don't care what happens to them.
Much like Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VII, 10 was the premiere of Final Fantasy on the next console generation. As such, there were many technical improvements that were very impressive for the time, the most obvious being the improved graphics.
On top of that, the faces were actually motion captured so the characters could be more expressive. Kind of. We'll come back to this. Another change from the PS1 era is the field maps. 7, 8, and 9 had your characters navigating a two-dimensional field, with the map being represented by a static image. Here, all the areas are rendered in 3D. Sometimes the camera moves with the player as they navigate the field, and other times they just do hard cuts like the Resident Evil series.
Another major change is the addition of voice acting. Every major cutscene is fully voice acted, and while this is not true for every single character, there are many NPCs that are voice acted.
So it's clear that this game took a big technical step forward, and it should be commended for that. But, not to sound too dismissive, but shouldn't new technicals kind of be a given with the next console generation? I mean, the jump from 6 to 7 was far more impressive than the jump from 9 to 10. With 7, there was a completely new direction and it totally reinvented the perception of the series, so much so that it increased the popularity of the JRPG genre in the West significantly. Of course, I don't expect 10 to breathe the same sort of new life in the series that 7 did, but the new technicals, for the most part, didn't wow me. I'll start with the facial animations. Many games prior to Final Fantasy X, and even a few after, just swapped facial textures to convey different emotions, And sure, it's cool to see the faces physically move, but more often than not, it just looks awkward. I think it probably would have been smarter to mix the real-time facial animation with subtle texture swapping to really help these cutscenes play out. But this is one of the first times this technology was used in video games, so some growing pains are to be expected. There are a lot of instances where things that were cool at the time may not hold up down the line, and where it may be awkward for some, it may not faze another. It's kind of like how some people think that the out-of-combat character models in 7 don't hold up. It's just a matter of perspective. The facial animations just didn't wow me, but I didn't find them to be too distracting. This is also the first Final Fantasy game to feature voice acting, and it too is a little awkward. I feel like the script could have been cleaned up in a few places. It seems like the translation was less than stellar. Characters sometimes end their sentences with the phrase, "you know," seemingly used at random.
You know?
You know?
You know? You know? You know?
You know?
Yes, I know. You don't have to keep asking.
Yeah, it's very clear that this was the team's first foray in using voice actors.
One of the most notable things is that every conversation sounds like the actors read their lines alone, with no one to vibe off of and without context.
Or they just went with the first take.
There are many instances where characters feel like they're almost having two separate conversations. It doesn't happen all the time, but you'll definitely notice it in scenes that feature an extensive amount of character interaction.
I still haven't thought of anything.
Me neither.
What are we gonna do?
We'll do something.
Riveting stuff, folks. What can I say? This is particularly frustrating in hindsight because all the actors in this game are well-known and respected talents, and I know they could have done a better job if they had the chance to actually record their lines together. So I can't fault the actors too much. Some of their voices are a little odd. It is a little distracting to hear John DiMaggio because Wakka really sounds like Bender fucked Hermes, and Yuna always sounds like she just ran up a flight of stairs. I think the character that suffers the most in the voice acting is Tidus. James Arnold Taylor is a great voice actor with an incredible range, but good fucking god, why did they have him talk like this? The nasal tone, the enunciation, the line delivery, it's all so grating to listen to. And it turns what would be a slightly underwritten character into an aggravating one. It makes Tidus seem way worse than he actually is. When he narrates, when he reacts, when he's supposed to be emotional, I don't buy it for a second and it just comes off as whiny.
Though, I would argue that his narration comes off slightly less stilted, mainly because he didn't have to sync his lines with the character's mouth.
I guess that's true, but the bad script isn't helping. I have to separate the script from the line delivery to judge the character appropriately, and it's really difficult with Tidus. Bad acting can totally change the perception of a character. I mean, look at the remake of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Despite it using almost the exact same script, John Gavin's line delivery versus Viggo Mortensen's is totally different, and it feels like a separate character despite the fact that they are both playing Sam Loomis.
Well, one of you better tell me what's going on and tell me fast. I can take just so much of this nonsense.
Take it easy, friend. One of you better tell me what's going on here and tell me fast. I can take just so much of this. Take it easy, friend.
Bad voice acting can really affect my enjoyment of a character. I know I've ranted about this a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, the voice acting isn't that bad. It's awkward at times, but with the exception of Tidus, it's nothing I couldn't get used to. Like I said before, this time around the environments are fully rendered in 3D rather than being 2D textures. I really like that, but traversing the world can be awkward at times. For the most part, the camera moves with the player nicely, but there are times when they do hard angle cuts like the Resident Evil games and they are really clunky and random. Look at this! What the fuck is up with this cutting? There are 3 separate angles in this 5 feet of land.
Plus, some of the cuts really mess up your character movement and have you do something stupid.
I have one major gripe with the maps, but I'll get into that later. Like the previous generation, Final Fantasy X mixes real-time cutscenes with pre-rendered FMV sequences. The FMVs in this game are absolutely stunning and I think some of the best in the series. They are gorgeously well animated, wonderfully synced with the music, and convey the appropriate emotions. Pretty much every cutscene with Yuna in particular is great. Even at times where the story isn't interesting me, the FMVs are excellent eye candy. But the in-game cutscenes are off.
You witness these stunning visuals with these highly detailed character animations with the FMV scenes. And then Tidus suddenly looks like a more feminine Owen Wilson in the in-game cutscenes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really jarring when we go back to the in-game cutscenes because I have no fucking idea what the camera is doing half the time. Like this. What the fuck is happening? What in the epileptic seizure is this? I don't get it. And the framing of half these scenes is just random. Like, they don't have any basic understanding of cinematography or shot composition, and they pan down on everyone's body way too much, so I constantly get a face full of Lulu's tits, people's asses, and pelvises, and it gets really uncomfortable. Plus, there's an excessive amount of ghosting that seems totally pointless. The costume and character designs of this game are just bizarre, and not in a good way. For the most part, I think the main cast looks fine. Waka's hair could be shorter and Lulu could cover up her titties, but they aren't the most distracting people. The most distracting person is Tidus. Just what the fuck is he even wearing? Farmer overalls made into shorts with one leg cut shorter than the other, a half vest with an extra sleeve, 2 different pairs of gloves, and a sweet pair of Timbs. Just what even is this? The sleeve part I can understand because Jekt has one too, so I guess it's Blitzball related, but everything else looks stupid. It doesn't even look right when compared to other people in Xanarkand. At least Cloud, Squall, and even Zidane wore outfits that made sense within their universe. Tidus just looks out of place no matter where he is. And then there's Donna. This is supposed to be a holy summoner? Did the Church of Yevon say that clothes are optional? And look at Lucille. What the fuck? She looks like she's dressed for roller derby on the beach. She looks ridiculous. But none of them compare to the secondary antagonist of this game, Seymour Guado.
I am Seymour Guado. I am honored to receive the title of Maester.
I'm crying from how stupid that is.
What the fuck am I looking at? Why did they give him this stupid hair? He looks like a Looney Tunes character that got zapped by lightning. Who decided to give him hair antlers? Wouldn't he look better without them? And then there's this open robe that shows off his gross chest hair. All of you need to stop cosplaying as him because you look stupid. Yeah, baby. I'm fucking moist just from looking at you!
A popular theory amongst the Final Fantasy fandom is that the character designer, Tetsuya Nomura, hates fan art, and he intentionally adds belts, leather straps, and zippers to all of his characters to make them harder to draw. For evidence of strange character designs, just look at Kingdom Hearts. Sora has zippers everywhere, and Aqua has boob straps. I just don't understand. But the creator himself stated that, at that time, people teased me about zippers and belts and whatnot, and I'm the type of person that if someone eggs me on enough, I'm going to do it more. And well, I guess that's case in point, I suppose.
Getting back to Seymour, he's supposed to be a surprise villain to the cast, but they seriously can't take one look at this dude with devil horns and evil head veins and put together that he's a bad guy? Are they really that clueless? I know I'm harping on the costume design, but when it's bad, it's really bad, and it undercuts the serious scenes when you have characters that look like idiots. I think the presentation of the game is inconsistent. At times, it's amazing, and at other times, it's really, really awkward.
The backstory of Spira is hard to get into without getting too far into spoilers, so we'll have to save that part for the end. But Spira is a nice, colorful place. With Final Fantasy X, the developers set out to make a world that reinvented how people perceive the fantasy genre, so they based Spira off of Southeast Asia rather than the typical European medieval setting that the genre is known for.
It's definitely a great idea, but as a whole, I don't think Spira is really all that different. I mean, Final Fantasy VII and VIII weren't all that European influenced either. There were no kings or knights. I guess 10 is banking on not having the same advanced technology that those games had, so in that sense, I think it succeeds. The whole game does have a very tropical feel to it, and I like that. There's a variety of locations, and most of them feel relatively distinct from each other without feeling too standard. However, trying to reinvent the perception of the fantasy genre does expose how much the developers actually relied on those preconceived notions in previous entries. For example, we never needed an explanation as to how people could cast magic. Magic is a standard thing in the fantasy genre, so we can just accept it with no logic attached. But people being able to hold their breath for 30 minutes at a time is not something that is common in fantasy, so without any explanation, it comes off as confusing. Because it's confusing, we would naturally want an explanation, but we never really get one. This doesn't wreck the game, obviously, but I think it would have been better if Blitzball players just wore underwater respirators like the Albed. Doing this would also feed into the good of technology and add a smaller dynamic to this world's struggle between religion and science.
there is noticeable diversity amongst the different groups of people in this world.
The Ronso look pretty cool. They look like the Thundercats that they were designed by Michael Bay. And as ridiculous as Seymour looks, the rest of the Guado don't look nearly as bad and actually kind of look like lost Dr. Seuss characters. I already said how I don't like that the Albed are portrayed as infidel weirdos, but I'm also confused as to whether being Albed is a way of life or a race. Just using Machina and not following Yevon seems to imply that they are just regular people without religion, but Orin identifies Riku as an Albed because she has a swirly pattern in her eyes, and Yuna is part Albed because she has 2 different eye colors. So is being Albed genetic? Is it a race? Is it a belief system? I don't know, and I don't think Square knows either. On the whole, I think Spira looks amazing. But that's it. It just looks amazing. It does not play amazing. This game is like Final Fantasy XIII. It's way too linear. This was the first Final Fantasy game to be fully rendered in 3D, so it's baffling to me that they made this world so incredibly restrictive. Just like 13, the majority of the game is just walking forward. It's so painfully boring. I feel like I'm on autopilot. Even when there are branching paths, they only go a few feet before leading to some minor treasure that really isn't worth it.
And there is always a red arrow on your minimap telling you exactly where you need to go. And honestly, it takes any sense of wonder and intrigue away from your travel, and you basically just move room to room.
One of the people involved with Final Fantasy X was Motomu Toriyama, the director of Final Fantasy XIII. It's no secret that Toriyama is not a fan of giving the player too much freedom, and it really showed with Final Fantasy X and XIII. He isn't the only one at fault here though. Both games had the same map designer, Takayoshi Nakazato. Nakazato said one of the reasons he did away with the world map was to make it more realistic. Bro, do you live in a mental institution with nothing but hallways? Because there's nothing realistic about only being able to move forward when you're outside. On the Beyond Final Fantasy DVD, one of my favorite things he said was,
"The map seems ordinary, but if you stand still and look around, you'll find small details like grass along the roadside, swaying in the wind, or the clouds moving. I hope you enjoyed these small details. I understand that you'll probably want to finish the game quickly, but try looking around when you have the chance. It'll help us feel that adding those little touches was worthwhile."
Look at the grass, guys! It's blowing in the wind! Isn't this so much more fun than having a full world to explore? Isn't this great? Isn't it fun to watch the fucking grass grow? I'm having the time of my life, senpai! I don't really have a problem with the game being linear, but you have to engage the player enough to prevent progression from feeling stale. I guess this worked for some people, but it didn't work for me at all. And while 10's linearity is not nearly as bad as 13's, it's still mindless, and I just feel like I'm on rails until I get to the next town. You do get an airship in 10, but you don't get to fly over and see Spira. You just get to pick where you want to go from a list. It sucks, and you don't even get to do this until the damn near end of the game. They encourage you to do side quests at the end, but after waiting this long, I'm just so sick of this world. I've pretty much seen everything there is to see already. When you got the airship in previous games, there were tons of new locations you could now visit. There are almost no new locations when you get this. And what few there are, they're just hidden maps that are super small and only give you treasure. Spira is a fantastic looking world that's as vast as an ocean, but as deep as a puddle. And beyond how gorgeous it looks, I really didn't get much out of it. Ugh. I am so sick of talking about this game.
You alright, bud? You want to talk about the game on my channel instead, champ?
Yes.
I can't hear you.
Yes.
Great! So folks, click the link down below or at the end of this video to see part 2 on my channel.
Hey guys, if you enjoy my content, then you should follow me on Twitter, where I post channel updates and information on upcoming videos. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching.